Now, last year, the Kenyan economy grew at its fastest pace in 5 years, largely due to growth in agriculture and tourism. Despite this, investors see no real incentive in investing in these sectors, facing various headwinds like climate change. It is suggested that government could change the sentiment by introducing tax reductions, exemptions, and maybe even cuts. Just how far can taxes go in solving Kenya's economic woes? Joining us from Kenya, Aly-Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management. Aly-Khan, always a pleasure and a good afternoon to you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'd like us maybe to reflect on that performance of the Kenyan economy in 2023. Of course, tourism and agriculture as key drivers there.
So I would describe it as a very resilient performance. Obviously, agriculture has the widest diffusion in terms of so many people are dependent on agriculture. It performed well because we had optimal rains in the first half of the year. And sometimes to predict Kenya's GDP, you've actually got to be a meteorologist because when the rains are good, agriculture performs and the underlying GDP dynamic performs as well. As you well know, we've had El Nino rains this year, so therefore it's difficult to predict how well or poorly agriculture will perform. But last year was an optimal year for agriculture. On the other side, you talked about tourism. Tourism, look, sometimes I look at the numbers and I look at your numbers in South Africa and I think, we're still in the playground. But we saw a significant uptick in earnings, about 1.75 million foreign visitors. So overall, that too performed well. And that too has a good diffusion profile because so many people depend on it. I think that 10 people end up servicing a single tourist over their visit. So yes, those two were the standout performers. Returning to agriculture, tea prices were good. Coffee, we're no longer such a big player in coffee. Floriculture, we're a big player, and horticulture was strong as well.
You have mentioned the rains here, Aly-Khan, and I want to speak about that because weather patterns, of course, are just becoming more and more unpredictable. So as we try to map out where the growth potential for Kenya's economy is in the future, can we rely on agriculture? And that's maybe because globally we're still trying to figure out what climate-resistant agriculture looks like.
You're completely correct. I mean, the recent rains we saw in Kenya were extreme and simply off the charts. These were the El Nino rains. Nairobi was flooded, roads turned into rivers. You couldn't, it was pretty apocalyptic. And we're seeing this frequency of extreme weather increase in any 5 to 10 year cycle. So you're correct, it's very difficult to predict. I do think, however, the net outcome for food prices is that we're going to be much higher for much longer than anyone is predicting in the global food markets, for example. But you're right, it does mean that you're going to have this very high beta performance out of the agricultural sector. And probably last year was a sweet spot, and this year will not be so sweet. So it's difficult to put in controls to sort of mitigate it. I think it's very tricky. You got to raise irrigation agriculture. You got to look at how you defend yourself against flooding. And a lot of our countries have not spent enough. Even the UAE, for example, didn't put any drainage in, as we saw. So it's a big investment that's got to be made.
I also like to touch on other industries besides agriculture and tourism that could be potential green shoots for the Kenyan economy.
Well, I think, Kenya historically has been one of the most industrialized economies in the region, but the challenge has been the tax regime. Kenya's big overarching challenge, which we didn't touch on really, has been the debt profile. Kenya has leveraged its long-standing relationships with the West and managed to bring in a ton of money from the likes of the IMF and the World Bank at concessional rates. That's a net positive. But the quid pro quo for that has been a new, much higher tax regime. And at times it feels as if our economists are not aware of something called the Laffer curve. You tax so high and then your tax take starts to slow down. And I think Kenya has hit that level, particularly in areas which are impacting industry, and industry is up in arms, for example, about recent tax reforms. And I think in order to reinvigorate those sorts of sectors, Kenya has got to look at what it's doing on taxes and take a deep breath and go back and fight its corner, particularly with the multilateral lenders who seem to be just keen to raise taxes on absolutely everything. So what are the promising sectors? Services, Kenya's big in services, very digitized economy, lots of young people who've embraced the new digital age. I think that has plenty of potential, as I said, industry, but we got to look at that from a tax perspective. And I think those are the two ones that really need close scrutiny.
And then let's also then speak about the tourism sector there. Of course, those numbers are growing, and Kenya actually lots to offer in this regard. Aly-Khan, in your mind, is this an issue of a better global marketing of Kenya as a tourism destination? Because, of course, like I said, there's just so much to see and do in Kenya.
Absolutely. I think, we got so much to offer from our game parks to our beaches. I think, and, I sometimes question some of tourism spending. I don't know how much seeing an advert on CNN drives your decision to go on a holiday to that country. I'm not convinced about that. I think it's more organic. It's more about reaching through the news media. It's about these new channels of communication like TikTok and Twitter and all these sorts of things about encouraging interest. But certainly, what is noticeable is there's been increased interest in Kenya as a destination. I'm not sure where it's really come from, but it's been very organic. But clearly, there's been plenty of interest, and I think there's a lot to build on. But the question is capacity, because the tourism sector has been very boom bust. We haven't seen long-term investments in that sector that we'd like to see. We've had a lot of new entrants come into Nairobi as a hot center for global hotel brands, but we haven't seen that really spill out into the other sides. Take the beach product, for example. The beach product is very, very dated and needs to be overhauled in total in order to compete globally. And I think that requires a lot of investment. And I think that is one area I think the government should be really looking at. How do they reinvent Kenya's beach destination product?
Well, we'll be watching very closely there. Very keen on Kenya myself. Thank you so much for your time, Aly-Khan. It's always a pleasure. That was Aly-Khan Satchu. He's CEO at Rich Management.